The Othax Dominion was known across the galaxy as a ruthless conqueror of worlds. Its empire stretched across vast sectors of space, and with each new conquest came the crushing certainty that no species could stand against their might. Their warships gleamed with technological marvels far beyond anything Earth had ever seen. Their weapons were precise and devastating, and their tactics were honed by centuries of warfare. But now Earth was next in their sights. Admiral Tirana stood aboard her flagship, staring out at the planet below her with cold, calculating eyes. She had watched civilizations crumble before her fleet. With ease, the people of Earth had no hope of survival. The Othax had already begun their descent to prepare for the invasion. But Tirana was not one to simply rush into battle. She knew the importance of understanding her enemies, first studying them in detail, knowing what made them tick and what weaknesses to exploit. So instead of launching an immediate attack, she ordered a more subtle approach, a thorough observation of Earth's society, its people, and its potential for resistance. Her ship lingered in orbit above the planet, her sensors sweeping the surface for any signs of advanced technology or military strategy. The results were disappointing at first. There were no signs of anything remotely capable of matching the power of the Othax fleet. Human technology was crude, primitive by Othax standards. But Tirana wasn't foolish enough to assume that such primitive weapons would make Earth an easy target. Humans were clever. They had survived on this world for millennia against odds that should have destroyed them long ago. There was something to be learned here, and Tirana was determined to find it. She requested more information, focusing her attention on Earth's entertainment systems and simulations. There was a particular game that seemed to have gained widespread popularity, a Starship simulator used by millions of humans. It was nothing special from the surface, a mere distraction for children and teenagers to pass the time, a simple game where players commanded virtual fleets of starships to engage in combat against simulated enemies. Tirana was curious, but she didn't expect much at first. She watched the game with detached interest and scoffed at its simplicity. But then something began to catch her attention. The humans playing the game weren't just following simple orders. They were making decisions with remarkable skill. Their fleets moved with a fluidity and precision that was unexpected. They knew how to calculate angles, anticipate moves, and counter threats in ways that seemed almost instinctual. Tirana's curiosity grew sharper as she watched more. The strategies employed by the players were unlike anything she had seen before, so unpredictable, so diverse. She found herself captivated by the creativity and adaptability of these humans. The game had been created to entertain, but it was teaching something far more dangerous than mere entertainment. It was teaching the fundamentals of warfare, complex maneuvers that could easily be adapted to real-world combat. And it was training children to think like commanders. Tirana's mind raced. Could this be a new form of training, something Earth had developed without even realizing it? She watched as the simulation became more intense, as the players grew more skilled. Some of them faced fleets that outnumbered them by 5 to 1, but they didn't surrender. They fought with everything they had, and somehow managed to turn the tide. It was at that moment Tirana realized that this wasn't just a game. It was something far more potent. It was a glimpse into the potential of humanity's greatest strength, their ability to adapt and overcome the impossible. Tirana's mind raced as she watched the game unfold before her. Her initial skepticism had given way to a growing sense of unease. The child's ability to command a virtual fleet with such precision was unsettling. It wasn't just strategy, it was instinctual. The way the human child anticipated enemy movements, countered flanking maneuvers, and anticipated every twist of the simulated battlefield with an ease that defied logic. How could a child this young master something so complex without formal training? Tirana leaned closer to her console, her eyes narrowed. This was no ordinary game. Something was different about it. And the more she observed, the more she realized the implications of what she was seeing. The child playing the simulator wasn't just making moves. He was thinking several steps ahead, planning his attacks with a complexity that mirrored military strategy she had seen in veteran commanders. The way the child's fleet moved seemed almost coordinated, as if each ship was aware of its role and purpose in the greater scheme of things. The child didn't simply react to threats, he anticipated them, as if he knew the game's outcome before it even began. And then there was the way he handled difficult situations, where the odds were overwhelmingly against him. Tirana had watched a dozen players make simple mistakes at moments like these, but the child didn't hesitate when faced with what seemed like certain defeat. He adapted, he improvised with a fearlessness that made Tirana question her earlier assumptions. This wasn't just a game, this was a battlefield. It was a school for war, and the children of Earth were its students. She quickly ordered her technicians to gather more data on the game's mechanics. It wasn't just some virtual exercise. This game was teaching something deeper. It was training minds to think in terms of war. The principles of fleet management, resource allocation, defense strategies, counterattacks, all were ingrained into the very fabric of the simulation. She couldn't help but feel a knot of dread in her stomach. Tirana had seen simulations like this in other cultures, but none had been so immersive. None had involved such a seamless integration of strategy and reality. Could this be the way humanity trained its future commanders and warriors? Tirana had heard rumors of human resilience before, how their species had survived against odds that should have broken them, but she had always dismissed them as exaggerations. Now she was witnessing firsthand the depth of human ingenuity. The child in the game had no formal military experience, yet he was outwitting his virtual enemies with strategies that would make seasoned generals stop and think for a moment. Tirana watched in silence as the child's fleet faced a seemingly insurmountable challenge of virtual force that outnumbered him 10-1, with no real way to win on paper. The battle was over before it even began, yet the child never flinched. He adapted. He feigned a retreat, luring the enemy fleet into a trap, as if he had orchestrated the entire battle before it even began. Tirana held her breath as the final move was executed, a devastating ambush from a hidden corner of the battlefield. The child's fleet tore through the enemy force with precision and efficiency. The simulation had ended, but for Tirana, it had only just begun. She sat back in her chair, a sinking feeling in her gut as the weight of what she had witnessed settled over her. This was no ordinary game. The child's brilliance wasn't just a fluke. It was a glimpse into a new kind of warfare, and it terrified her, because if this was how humanity was training itself, if this was the raw potential they were nurturing, then the Orcs might have just underestimated Earth's greatest weapon. Tirana's mind swirled with questions as she continued to watch the simulation replay, each move, each tactic playing out on her screens like a story unfolding. The child's uncanny ability to adapt, to turn a losing battle into a decisive victory, felt like something beyond mere chance. She had seen the strategies of dozens of civilizations, but this was different. Humans, despite their seemingly primitive technology, were capable of thinking in ways that her own race had never anticipated. There was something wild, untamed about their approach to warfare, and it was a force she couldn't easily categorize. The Orcs had always relied on their technology, superior weapons, faster ships, overwhelming numbers. But what if, just maybe, that wasn't enough against an enemy like this? The more Tirana analyzed Max's gameplay, the more she realized that it wasn't just a game for him. The child was learning. No, he was training. Max was mastering the art of warfare with a natural flair that suggested a deeper instinct, a kind of untapped potential in humanity. He didn't just rely on brute force. He thought on a higher level, anticipating, deceiving, outmaneuvering. And as she saw him grow more skilled with each battle, she couldn't shake the uncomfortable thought. What if all humans were like this? Tirana paused the simulation, replaying the final sequence again. Max's fleet had been almost destroyed, cornered by an overwhelming enemy. Yet, somehow, the child had turned it around. He had sacrificed what seemed like his last remaining starship to create a decoy, luring the enemy's forces into a blind spot. It was an unorthodox move, one that any seasoned commander might have dismissed as foolhardy. But for Max, it worked. The enemy fleet had fallen right into his trap. The result was a crushing victory, one that defied all expectations. Tirana's pulse quickened. This wasn't just talent, it was a glimpse of something much larger, a fundamental shift in how a species could wage war. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Tirana's people, the Orcs, had long relied on their dominance over other species, their advanced technology, their strict hierarchy of command. They fought with efficiency, precision, and cold logic. There was no room for improvisation, no room for surprises. Everything was calculated, but watching this child play, watching Max outsmart the very rules of warfare, made Tyranna question her assumptions. Could it be that humanity's strength lay not in their weapons or their fleets, but in their ability to think beyond the boundaries of tradition? Tyranna's fingers hovered over her console, debating whether to send the data she had gathered to her superiors. But something stopped her. The more she watched, the more she felt an odd sense of respect growing within her. She was used to being the predator, the one who controlled the situation, the one who dictated the terms of the conflict. Yet here she was, unsure of what this child might do next. She had no idea how humanity would react in an actual war. Could they surprise the Othax in ways she couldn't predict? The idea unsettled her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. She had expected Earth's people to be helpless, their resistance futile. But now, after seeing what she had just witnessed, Tyranna realized that underestimating humans might be the gravest mistake the Othax could make. She had seen what they were capable of in a virtual world. What about the real one? Could humans take the strategies they had mastered in a game and apply them to real combat? What if Earth wasn't just a helpless world waiting to be conquered, but a sleeping giant, quietly training its warriors for an unknown future? The child's next move in the simulation caught her attention. Max, as though sensing her gaze, made a move so bold, so unexpected, that Tyranna felt a chill run down her spine. The human mind, it seemed, was not only capable of learning, it was capable of evolving faster than she had ever imagined. Tyranna sat back in her chair, eyes narrowed. She had underestimated Earth, and for the first time in her long career as an Admiral, Tyranna found herself unsure of what the future held. Tyranna found herself watching the simulation with growing fascination, her thoughts clouded with the realization that humanity was more than just an easy target. The child, Max, wasn't just a fluke, and the game wasn't simply a tool for amusement. It was a window into the very heart of what made humans dangerous. Their unpredictability, their creativity, their refusal to give up when faced with overwhelming odds. It was all there, on display in ways she hadn't even begun to comprehend. As she continued to observe, Tyranna began to dig deeper into the history of human warfare. She tapped into Earth's archives, scanning through thousands of years of conflict, from ancient battles fought with crude weapons to the technological wars of the present day. What she found was a pattern, something she hadn't noticed before. Humanity had never truly been defeated. Time and again, they had faced extinction, massive wars, natural disasters, plagues, and somehow, against all odds, they had survived. The victories were often small, incremental, but they added up. Tyranna couldn't help but feel a growing sense of respect for this species that seemed to thrive under pressure, that learned from its mistakes and used failure as fuel for innovation. But that respect was tinged with something else. Fear. The Othax had always been the apex predators of the galaxy, their technology and tactics unrivaled. But now, as she watched Max's fleet outmaneuver an opponent many times its size, Tyranna couldn't shake the growing suspicion that the Othax might have made a grave miscalculation. The true strength of humanity wasn't in their weapons or their fleets. It was in their minds. Their ability to adapt, to improvise, to think outside the rigid confines of strategy. It was something the Othax hadn't accounted for. Tyranna's fingers hovered over her console, the data she had gathered swirling in her thoughts. She knew that Earth's leaders had not yet realized the full extent of their species' potential. Most likely, they were still in the early stages of developing their military prowess. They were still learning, still growing, and that thought terrified her. What if they were far more advanced than the Othax realized? What if humanity, with its endless capacity for reinvention, could eventually challenge the Dominion in ways she couldn't predict? The more Tyranna reflected on what she had witnessed, the more she understood that humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to think beyond conventional war. Their tactics were unorthodox, even chaotic at times, but they were effective. And Max was the embodiment of this unrestrained genius. He wasn't following the usual rules of warfare, he was rewriting them. Tirana had seen human resistance before. Small rebellions, scattered pockets of resistance that crumbled under the weight of the Othax might. But none of it had been like this. No human resistance had ever shown the kind of coordination or ingenuity that Max had displayed in a game meant for entertainment. And if a child could do this with virtual ships, what could he do with real ones? What could humans do if they were given the right tools, the right resources? Her thoughts were interrupted as a new report flashed on her screen. It was an update from the fleet, indicating that preparations for the invasion were almost complete. The Othax were ready to strike. But Tirana hesitated. Her instinct told her to launch the attack immediately, to crush this world before humanity had a chance to organize. But her mind kept coming back to Max, to the way he played the game, to the untapped potential she had seen in the way humans adapted to impossible odds. The fleet was ready. Earth was unprepared. And yet, Tirana's gut told her that there was something more here, something that required a deeper understanding. Perhaps it was foolish to launch the invasion without fully grasping the enemy she was about to face. Tirana stood, pacing her command center. She had made countless decisions in her career, each one certain, each one backed by the overwhelming superiority of the Othax. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure. She knew one thing for certain. Underestimating humanity might be the most dangerous mistake the Othax could make. With a deep breath, Tirana made a decision. She would delay the invasion. She would need more information, more observation. The human mind, she realized, was more than just a puzzle. It was a weapon. And before the Othax struck, she needed to understand it fully. She couldn't afford to ignore the unexpected genius of a child playing the game. The future of the galaxy might depend on it. Tirana paced her command deck, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. The decision to delay the invasion weighed heavily on her, but she knew it was the right one. The Othax had always relied on their overwhelming power to crush lesser civilizations, but what she had seen on Earth, what she had seen in Max's game, was unsettling. Humanity's potential for ingenuity, their ability to turn the tables in ways no one expected, could change everything. She wasn't sure if they were aware of the danger they posed yet, but she was beginning to see them in a different light. Her officers remained unaware of her internal turmoil, continuing their preparations for the invasion with the usual confidence. They had no reason to doubt her orders, no reason to question the strength of the Othax fleet. To them, Earth was still a primitive world, a place ripe for conquest. But Tirana could no longer shake the feeling that she was about to make a mistake. There was something deeply wrong with the assumption that Earth was just another easy target, and she needed to find out exactly what it was before her fleet descended upon the planet. She ordered more surveillance, more data gathering. But it wasn't just about the game anymore. It was about humanity as a whole. How had they come so far, so quickly, with technology so inferior to the Othax? What was driving their survival instincts? What had shaped their minds into something capable of thinking so unconventionally? She needed answers, and she needed them now. The days passed slowly, each one filled with more observations, more tests. Tirana watched Max play again, noticing the subtle shift in his gameplay. He had grown more confident, more daring with each new simulation. He took risks that once would have seemed reckless, but somehow he always seemed to make it work. She began to wonder if this was what all human children were like, full of potential that only needed the right environment to flourish. And then there was the question of how humanity had developed such environments. Had the humans simply been lucky, or had they been unknowingly cultivating their own future warriors? In the midst of her growing unease, a new development sent a jolt through her thoughts. Earth's military leaders, despite their primitive technology, had begun to implement tactics that seemed oddly familiar. As she watched reports from human satellites and military exercises, Tirana noted the increasing complexity of their maneuvers. They were mimicking some of the strategies she had seen in Max's simulations, strategies that defied traditional military logic. They were outthinking their own systems, using creativity in ways that baffled even the most advanced minds. The game had begun to shape their future, just as she had feared. Tirana now found herself at a crossroads. Every instinct told her to strike, to end this observation and attack with the full might of the Othax fleet. But the more she learned, the more she realized that taking that step might be the worst decision she could make. The more she uncovered about humanity's resilience and creative genius, the more she felt the weight of her responsibility as an admiral. If Earth's potential was even half of what she feared, this might not be a war the Othax could win, even with their superior technology. Tirana reached out to her senior commanders, calling them into a virtual meeting. As they assembled, she remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the holographic projection of Earth below. The familiar image of a peaceful, unassuming planet now seemed deceptively fragile. "Admiral, the fleet is ready," one of her commanders said, his voice laced with impatience. "We've studied their military systems, and there's nothing to suggest they pose a serious threat." Tirana could feel the weight of the commander's confidence, and yet, deep down, she knew something they didn't. The Othax had never faced an enemy like this before, an enemy whose greatest strength lay in its unpredictability. "Delay the invasion," she said, her voice steady but resolute. The words felt like a heavy burden. Her officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Delay it?" another commander asked, disbelief creeping into his tone. "But the fleet is ready, and we've already established dominance in the sector. Earth is defenseless." Tirana's gaze hardened. "No, we need more time, more information. We have underestimated them, and I won't make that mistake again." The room fell silent, and Tirana could feel the weight of their skepticism bearing down on her. But she had seen enough. Humanity was more dangerous than they realized, and if the Othax were to succeed, they would have to change their approach. No longer would they rely on brute force alone. They needed to understand the enemy fully before they could strike. She had seen Max's genius firsthand, and she knew it wasn't isolated. Humanity as a whole had the potential to rewrite the rules of war in ways the Othax could never predict. The next move was critical. The Othax might have the superior fleet, but if they were to win, they would need to respect the most unexpected and powerful weapon Earth had: its people's minds. Tirana's decision to delay the invasion was met with resistance, but she stood firm. Her officers, though initially skeptical, respected her authority. They would continue the observation, but now, the mood aboard the flagship had shifted. Tirana wasn't simply gathering data anymore. She was preparing for a different kind of battle. One of intellect and strategy, not just firepower. The Othax might have superior technology, but humanity's mind, as unpredictable as it was, might just be the greatest force of all. As the days passed, the surveillance of Earth intensified. Tirana's flagship remained hidden in the farthest reaches of the solar system, undetected by the humans below. The crew worked tirelessly to monitor every broadcast, every communication, every military exercise they could find. The more data they gathered, the clearer it became that humanity was evolving, learning, adapting in ways Tirana hadn't anticipated. Their simulation games were no longer mere distractions. They were becoming real-world training grounds, honing the next generation of commanders. Max, the child who had first piqued her curiosity, became the focal point of her observations. The more she watched, the more she realized that this was no isolated case. Max was part of a greater pattern, a worldwide phenomenon where every child, it seemed, was being trained in the same unorthodox strategies. The games weren't just games. They were honing an entire generation to think beyond the confines of conventional warfare. A new kind of warfare was emerging, one where human minds were the most dangerous weapon of all. Tirana found herself compelled to learn more about Max's world, about the way humans raised their young. She had expected Earth to be primitive, disorganized, and reliant on outdated methods of conflict resolution. Instead, she saw a global society that was quietly preparing for something greater. Children like Max, raised in an environment where creative thinking was the key to survival, were growing into an elite force, capable of seeing possibilities that no one else could. This, she realized, was how humanity had survived for so long, by bending the rules, by making the impossible possible. One evening, as she reviewed more footage of Max's gameplay, something caught her attention. In the simulation, Max's fleet was once again outnumbered, cornered in a seemingly hopeless situation. But this time, Max wasn't simply retreating or luring the enemy into a trap. He was negotiating with the virtual opponent. The AI, programmed to follow strict military logic, was caught off guard by Max's suggestion, a ceasefire. Max's fleet had no power to win outright, but instead of continuing the battle, Max proposed a temporary alliance to share resources and trade technology. The AI, unable to comprehend the logic behind such an offer, hesitated, but ultimately accepted. It was an unthinkable move in traditional warfare. Alliances were made with the understanding of mutual benefit, not with those who were actively trying to destroy you. But Max's negotiation skills, even within a game, hinted at something far deeper than mere combat knowledge. He understood the value of diplomacy, of strategy beyond the battlefield. In the real world, such a tactic could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Tirana's mind reeled. The humans were not just training for battle. They were preparing for diplomacy, for alliances, for strategies that could flip the very nature of conflict on its head. Earth wasn't just building up its military force. They were building a new form of warfare that mixed combat, negotiation, and adaptability into a single, unpredictable force. For the first time in her life, Tirana felt the weight of uncertainty. She was used to knowing exactly how a battle would unfold. But humanity's strength, their ability to think, adapt, and negotiate, made everything feel like a gamble. The Orcs had never encountered a species like this before. But there was something else that lingered in her thoughts, a deeper realization. If humanity's strength lay in its creativity and adaptability, then perhaps the greatest weapon the Orcs had at their disposal wasn't their fleet at all. It was the ability to understand humanity, to outthink them, to beat them at their own game. And Tirana, for the first time in her life, began to wonder, what if the Orcs could learn from humanity's example? What if they, too, could adapt and evolve in response to this unexpected threat? The answer, as she knew all too well, lay in the strategy ahead. Tirana had to find a way to outthink them before humanity had the chance to outthink her. Rana's thoughts churned as she continued to watch Earth, but now with a new sense of urgency. The longer she observed, the more she realized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't just in its ability to wage war. It was in its endless capacity for innovation. This insight, born from watching Max and countless others play simulations, was beginning to crystallize into something more profound. The Orcs had always relied on overwhelming force, their superior technology, and unyielding discipline winning them battles. But against an enemy that could bend the rules of war, that could think beyond their own strategies, Tirana wasn't sure the old ways would be enough. Her mind kept returning to the idea of negotiation, a concept so foreign to the Orcs. In her culture, victory was always absolute. Negotiations were a sign of weakness. But Max's actions, his ability to weave diplomacy into a game designed for combat, suggested that humanity's ability to engage in complex negotiations was just as potent as their ability to fight. If the Orcs were to win, they would need more than just weapons. They would need to outthink humanity at its own game. Tirana could no longer rely on brute strength alone. Her officers noticed the shift in her demeanor. They could see that she was troubled, that something about this mission was no longer as clear-cut as it once had been. One of her senior commanders, Galthur, approached her, his tone hesitant but firm. "Admiral," he said, "we've been watching Earth for weeks now. The fleet is prepared, Our forces are primed, and yet you continue to delay the attack. What is it that you see in these humans that is making you hesitate? We can crush them. We've done it before." Tirana turned to face him, her expression cold but thoughtful. "It's not about what I see in them, Galthor. It's what I don't understand yet. These humans, this species, are unpredictable. We thought they were primitive, easy to control. But they're more than that. They're resourceful. They adapt in ways I never expected." Galthor scoffed. "Adaptation is irrelevant when faced with the overwhelming might of the Othax fleet. A few games and simulations won't change the fact that they can't possibly stand against us." Tirana fixed him with a sharp gaze. "That's what we thought before. And if we don't change our approach, we might make the same mistake. We're facing an enemy that doesn't just fight with weapons. They fight with ideas. Max's ability to negotiate in a game isn't a fluke. It's a pattern. It's a glimpse into how they think, how they'll fight. We can't simply overpower them. We need to outthink them." For a moment, Galthor said nothing, his skepticism still evident in his expression. But he could see the conviction in her eyes. The Othax had always prided themselves on their ability to crush their enemies quickly, decisively. But if humanity truly had the power to outsmart them, to change the rules of war mid-fight, then victory would not be so simple. He could sense it now, that nagging doubt creeping into his own mind. "Then what do you propose?" he asked, his tone now more curious than dismissive. Tirana paused, considering. The truth was, she didn't have all the answers. But she knew that attacking Earth without understanding the full scope of their potential would be a catastrophic mistake. They needed to understand the humans better, to anticipate their every move, and to learn from their creativity, their strategic brilliance. "We need to shift our focus. We need to learn from them. Watch how they use their minds, their diplomacy, their unexpected tactics. We cannot simply treat this as another conquest. We need to study them as if they were our equals, because in many ways they already are." The words hung in the air between them. Galthor didn't reply immediately, but he nodded, his expression thoughtful. He had always trusted Tirana's instincts, and for the first time, he could see that her hesitation wasn't out of fear. It was out of respect for an enemy that had proven itself capable of something the Othax had not anticipated. "Understood, Admiral," Galthor said at last. "We'll continue our observations, but how long do you intend to wait before we make a move?" Tirana glanced out at the planet below, the swirling blue and green of Earth so vibrant, so alive with possibility. Her instincts told her that this was a moment unlike any other. If they waited too long, Earth might evolve even further, might develop new strategies that could become insurmountable. But if they acted too soon, they would risk making a fatal mistake. "We will move when we understand them fully," she said, "and when we know that we can outthink them at every turn." The silence that followed was heavy, but Tirana felt something shift within her. She had always relied on her ability to control situations, to predict outcomes. But now, as she watched humanity's potential unfold before her, she realized that the key to victory wouldn't be control, it would be understanding. And once the Othax understood humanity, truly understood their ingenuity, they would know how to win. But first, they needed to learn how to think like humans. It was a dangerous game, but it was the only way forward. Tirana stood at the helm of her flagship, staring out at the Earth below. The blue and green orb was beautiful, but beneath its surface, she now saw something far more complex, something the Othax had missed entirely in their initial assessment. Humanity was not just a species of survivors. They were a species of innovators, of risk-takers, of minds capable of turning the most desperate situations into opportunities. Tirana had spent weeks studying them, watching their games, their military exercises, their every move, and she had come to one undeniable conclusion. Underestimating them would be a grave mistake. She had delayed the invasion long enough. But now, after all the data and analysis, she had a new understanding of humanity. They were dangerous not because of their weapons, not because of their numbers, but because of their mindset. The Orcs had always thought that sheer power could solve everything. But what if the key to defeating humanity wasn't more firepower? It was adapting to their way of thinking. The tension aboard her flagship was palpable. The crew was growing restless, eager to strike. They had spent far too long in the outer edges of the solar system, waiting, watching, and analyzing. The fleet was ready, yet Tirana felt the weight of their expectations bearing down on her. The Orcs were used to certainty, to executing their plans with precise efficiency. But humanity had taught her something different. There was no certainty when facing an enemy that could think in ways you couldn't predict. Tirana had thought long and hard about the strategy the Orcs would employ. It was clear to her now that brute force alone wouldn't guarantee victory. In fact, it might play right into humanity's hands if she launched the invasion as initially planned. She was all but certain the humans would resist, and they would resist in ways no one expected. If they were going to win, the Orcs would have to play their own game, one that required more than overwhelming might. It required intelligence. It required the ability to think beyond the conventional. Her thoughts were interrupted by a communication from Galfor, her most trusted commander. His voice came through, clipped and formal as usual. "Admiral, the fleet is prepared to strike. The humans have made no significant military moves in recent days. We have them at a disadvantage. The time for hesitation has passed." Tirana closed her eyes for a moment, weighing the situation. The clock was ticking, and every instinct screamed at her to act, to strike before humanity had the chance to adapt any further. But something deep inside her, held her back. She knew this was more than just a battle. This was a test of whether the Orcs could evolve. "Continue monitoring," she replied softly, "but hold off on the attack. I need more time." She didn't expect Galfor to understand. The Orcs valued decisiveness above all else, and she had just delayed the inevitable again. But her instincts told her that if the Orcs attacked now, they risked underestimating the humans' ability to turn the tide. Earth had not yet fully realized the power it possessed, and if the Orcs moved too quickly, they would force humanity into a corner, one from which they would be forced to fight back with every ounce of creativity and resourcefulness they had. Tirana turned away from the view, facing the cold, sterile interior of the command deck. It was a strange feeling, this uncertainty. In all her years as an admiral, she had never hesitated. But now, standing on the precipice of war, she realized that understanding the enemy, truly understanding them, was just as crucial as knowing how to destroy them. She had learned more about humanity than she ever thought possible. They were not just another race to be subjugated. They were a species that would one day change the galaxy. In time, the Orcs might need to find new ways to engage, new tactics to evolve alongside this emerging power. "Admiral," Galfor's voice came again, hesitant. "The fleet is growing anxious. We are ready for battle." Tirana didn't reply immediately. She thought back to Max, to the child who had unknowingly opened her eyes to the depth of humanity's potential. She thought of how his ability to negotiate with the game's AI had revealed something far greater. Humanity's ability to think creatively, to break boundaries, and to win not just by force, but by changing the game itself. "No," she said at last, her voice steady. "We will not strike. Not yet." Galfor fell silent, but she could feel his confusion, his disbelief. But for Tirana, the decision was clear. Humanity was not the enemy she had once thought them to be. They were a challenge that would force the Orcs to rethink everything they had ever known about conflict. As the flagship continued to drift in the shadows of the solar system, Tirana stood tall. The future was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. The Orcs had underestimated humanity, and now it was time to understand them fully before making any move. The galaxy had just been introduced to a new player, a species with the ability to rewrite the rules, and Tirana was determined to find out if the Orcs could learn to play their game.